Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. There are certain books that mark a before and an after in our journey as readers. There are certain novels that amplify our perception of the genre and its possibilities. Don Quixote was such a novel for me. So was 100 Years of Solitude. So was Hopscotch. And so was Die Blechtrommel, The Tin Drum by Günter Grass. I read this when I was in college in the Ralph Manheim translation, which is the one that I am showing you right here. And to say that it blew me away, it would be just a gross understatement. Now, for the podcast that I'm doing on the Nobel Prize winners, I am telling you about all of them, hopefully. I keep hoping that I will be able to do that. So I had to talk about Günter Grass, and I thought, I don't want to read another book by him. I would rather revisit The Tin Drum, which made such a huge impact on me. And I found out that there was a newer translation than the one that I had read. It is this one right here. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to revisit the text and to pay a visit to my old friend Oscar Matzarat after so many years. So the question here could be, why is there a new translation? This translation is by Breon Mitchell, and it was published in 2009. So it turns out, and I did not know this, that Grass was not entirely satisfied with the previous translation by Manheim. There's an issue, for example, with the punctuation. The older translation did not really reflect the way that Grass would use punctuation, and that of course is a big problem, because what we have here is the style of the author. And in this case we have a novel that is in a way told to us, narrated to us. Another thing that was missing in the original translation, or the earlier one, was the inventiveness of Günter Grass when it comes to language. He is an author who likes to make up words. He likes neologisms and combining different terms and all sorts of play with language. So that was another thing that it was felt that the Manheim translation did not quite get well or properly. So one thing we have to understand about The Tin Drum is that when the novel was published originally in German, it also baffled readers of German. Okay, so it's not like, it's confusing in English due to a lost in translation kind of thing. No, this is a novel that is just very, very playful. The language is not your usual German. So that was one thing that also caused a little bit of an abyss right there, I would say, not a little bit, but a very, very big difference between the original text and the translation in English. So what happened was that for the 50th anniversary of the novel, 2009, the novel was originally published, of course, in 1959, Grass invited a lot of translators from all sorts of countries, from all sorts of languages, to his place. And he spent time with them, reading the novel to them and clarifying some points that might give rise to confusion. They also walked around the city of Danzig, visited places that are referenced in the novel. So I think this is something that tells you that Grass was an author who really, really cared. He was concerned with the way his works were translated, which is something that, doesn't happen very often. I wanted to read you just a couple of lines from the translators afterward when it comes to this idea of why do we need a new version of this text? It's already a classic, right? So Mitchell says, "It is precisely the mark of a great work of art that it demands to be retranslated. What impels us towards new versions is not the weakness of existing translations, but the strength and richness of certain works of literature. The works that are never retranslated are those we only care to read once." And then a little bit below that he says, "A translation is a reading, and every reading is necessarily personal, perhaps even idiosyncratic. Each new version offers not a better reading, but a different one that foregrounds new aspects of the text and sees it through new eyes that makes it new." He says that there's a special kind of magic about the classics. They seem to survive sometimes, the passing of time, and they read well decades and decades after they were published. But the same is not true, according to Mitchell, of translations. And that is why we need to constantly renew our experience of certain classic texts of literature. So we're talking about the Nobel Prize winners. Günter Grass won the Nobel Prize in 1999, and I'm going to share with you the citation. It was awarded to him, quote, whose frolicsome black fables portray the forgotten face of history. So I think the two key words here are fables and history. On the one hand, the citation is referencing Grass's fondness for animal characters, and you just need to read the titles of his novels to realize this. Of course, his second novel was titled Cat and Mouse. His third one is Dog Years, right? And you can just look at the titles: From the Diary of a Snail, The Flounder, The Rat, The Call of the Toad, Crab Walk. So you have animals all over the place. And I think personally, you know, of Germany as the land of folktales. This is probably due to the presence of the Brothers Grimm. But what Grass does is to take these folktales, these fables, and turn them upside down. He rewrites them. He gives you a new version of them, and he uses these characters for his own purposes. And he was also, going to the other side of the citation, he was also very concerned with the concept of history, with how we produce history, with how we consume history. And we are going to talk about this definitely. You can see a metaphor to tie the two issues together of history and the diary of a snail, right? The snail is history because, yes, it moves, but it moves very slowly in such a way that sometimes we don't even realize that it's moving. Let's talk a little bit about structure. The Tin Drum has a three-part structure, and it's very, very clear and very straightforward. We have events that happen before the war, during the war, and after the war. And I am talking, of course, about World War II. We have 563 pages to this novel, 46 chapters, and it's an episodic type of structure that he favors here. Sometimes you're going to notice that there are gaps between the events of one chapter and the next one, and Oscar, our narrator, is going to tell us about that. Many of the chapters actually revolve around an object, not necessarily around a character, but we have an object. For example, the chapter titled Niobe. And we learn about what happened to the characters through the exploration of that object. And another interesting thing, structure-wise here, still speaking about that, is that just as in 100 Years of Solitude, you have certain chapters or even threads that you could take apart, you can take them out of the novel and sort of have like a short story right there, or maybe even a novella. The same thing happens with the Tin Drum. There are many episodes here that you could read independently and enjoy them as short stories. I'm thinking, just an example off the top of my head, the chapter titled The Onion Seller, which takes place in the third part of the novel. It's about a place where people pay so that they can be made to cry. So they literally go to a place where you pay to cry. And that's a chapter. You know, you can read that chapter independently. And there are, of course, many, many more throughout this novel. And I really like that structure. This idea that a novel, a story, a unit, is made up of very different stories that are put together almost like a mosaic. You get a mosaic view of what life was like in a given period of time and also in a given place. So I'm going to tell you now a little bit about the plot, okay, the characters, the narrator, and just read the first statement that we have in this novel, which already speaks volumes and already sets the tone for the entire text. Granted, I'm an inmate in a mental institution. Okay, so unreliable narrator, yes, you can say that again. This is a beginning a la Catcher in the Rye, almost, okay? So the Tin Drum is the story of Oskar Matzerath. He is going to be our narrator throughout the story, from beginning to end. And according to his account, he is able to think, to process information, and to understand everything that is going on around him from the moment that he is born. So yes, I mean, this is a narrator that we have to question. We think, you know, why does this happen to him? What is going on here? So he is born, and there are two promises that are made to him at that moment. His mother says, at the age of 3, I am going to give Oscar a tin drum. And his father says, one day when he is able, he is going to inherit the business. So he's growing up with those two promises right there. Now there's a problem. Oscar does not like what he sees. He is not happy about the world, especially he's not happy about the world of adults. And from that very first moment that he's born, what he wants to do, the only thing that he wants to do is to go and crawl back into his mother's belly. Here's what he does. At the age of 3, so remember, this is the age when he gets the tin drum, he decides that he is going to stop growing. How does he achieve that? He throws himself down the stairs. He sets everything up so that it's going to look like an accident, but he says that he willingly threw himself down the stairs so that the trauma would cause him to stop growing. So we are, of course, in the presence of literary ambiguity. Did he actually decide this and throw himself, make this decision at the age of 3? Or is this a myth that he has created around an accident that he had at that age that caused him to stop growing? He soon discovers another very important thing about himself, and that is that he has this piercing cry with which he is able to shatter glass around him. And he's going to use it many times in the novel, to the dismay of many of the other characters around him. There's another important issue going on. There are many interesting things about this character. He has 2 fathers. He doesn't, okay? But that's the way he looks at it, because he doesn't really know which one of the 2 men in his mother's life is his father. We have on the one hand Alfred Mazerat, his official father, and then on the other hand we have Jan Bronski. Alfred is portrayed as a boor. He's kind of like a brute in the way that he's depicted in this novel, whereas Bronski, who has the Polish heritage, is portrayed in a much more sympathetic way. Now, Oscar has a strong suspicion as to who his father is, right? You're going to see that if you read the novel. But at the end of the day, we don't really know, and he doesn't really know. He doesn't tell us for sure which of these 2 men is his father. So that's why he considers that he has 2 of them. There's another key character, and that is Bebra. Okay, Bebra is also a little person. Okay, he's a small guy, but he is much, much older than Oscar. And the 2 meet during a circus presentation. There's also a little lady who is in the company of Bebra, and that is Roswitha. She's going to be a very important character too for Oscar in particular. So Bebra is going to reappear. Look out for him, because he's going to reappear and recur at important moments throughout this story. We also meet Maria, who is Oscar's first love. And I told you before that the novel is divided into 3 parts. Part 2, as I said, focuses on the years during the war. And in this one we see, for example, Oscar becoming for a moment only the leader of a gang. Okay, and this is basically a gang that adopts him as a symbol. Think about this, somebody who doesn't want to grow up, this idea of the fear of maturity, the fear of becoming an adult, the fear of the adult world. So a lot of that is present right there in the second part of the novel. And then the third part, which is the one that deals with the post-war years, we have Oscar moving to a different place with other people. I don't want to give you too many details because I would like for you to experience this novel by yourself. And he finds a job at one point carving tombstones. He also works as a model. And then towards the end of the novel, things get really, really complicated for him. A key element here, a key thread, is his obsession with nurses. Okay, so look out for that, and that has catastrophic effects and results for him, especially towards the end of the story. The novel, we have to say this, is just packed with really interesting, really memorable secondary characters. There's, for example, Marcus, the toy seller. Okay, he's going to be very important, especially in the first third of the novel, I would say. We also have Herbert Truczynski, whose back is covered with scars. Very, very colorful characters here. And we also have Bruno, who is the keeper, the caretaker at the mental institution, who is in charge of Oscar. So he has kind of like an artistic bent, so that's what makes him interesting in this case. So look out for these secondary characters, because there are many, many, and many of them. You could say from this perspective maybe that The Tin Drum is kind of like a Dickensian novel. You know how in Charles Dickens sometimes the secondary characters are even more interesting than the main characters or the protagonist? Well, I wouldn't say that that is entirely the case with this one, because the main characters are really, really important, but there's definitely a little bit of that. And by the way, we're going to talk a little bit more about this towards the end. Many of these secondary characters did not make it into the movie, okay, into the film adaptation. But as I said, there's more to come about that. I'm not going to analyze the movie in this video. I'm thinking maybe I should do a video on the movie, like a separate one. But I'm going to give you enough information for you to have an idea of how this adapted to film language. Genre. Okay, I always like to talk about genre. And for this one, I wanted to mention primarily 3 points, okay, three ways, three types of genre, three directions from which we can approach the Tin Drum. And the first one that I wanted to mention is the family saga. Of course, this is a parody of the family saga. We have two fathers, okay, we don't ever know what happened to Oscar's grandfather, for example. There are a lot of myths going on right here. So I would say a parody of the family saga in the way that maybe 100 Years of Solitude could be a parody of that. Many people, for example, speak of magical realism when talking about the Tin Drum. I'm not going to do that, but it's certainly another possibility that you can follow. It is also an upside down bildungsroman. Okay, usually in the bildungsroman you have this idea of progress, right, going from darkness to light. In this case we have completely the opposite. We have a descent into madness instead of an enlightenment, as or an awakening, even as the story continues to progress, right? We have that Oscar, the way that he learns how to read is through texts by Goethe and through texts that deal with Rasputin. So you have those two, that double, what's the word that I'm looking for, heritage that he has when growing up and when developing. And you also have, due to this idea of the fact that he decided to stop growing, a distorted viewpoint. You have things that look and are described as grotesque because they are seen from the perspective of somebody who decided theoretically to remain small. So this is really a grotesque story. It's a Rabelaisian story. I thought of Fellini, for example, while I was reading this. And I was also reminded of that film Leolo. Okay, I did not like that film, by the way, so I'm sorry if you happen to be a fan. But, there's a lot of the grotesque in that film. It's a Canadian film. And it really reminded me, maybe there's a kind of an influence of the Tin Drum on that movie. And the other point that I wanted to mention, so we have, a kind of a parody of the family saga, an upside-down Bildungsroman, and also we have what I like to call an X-ray novel. I think I mentioned this before when I talked about Berlin Alexanderplatz by Alfred Döblin, right? So you have that novel, sort of like also another example that I have given is Journey to the End of the Night by Louis Ferdinand Céline. It's a novel that gives you an X-ray of society. It explores for example, in this case, of course, we have the rise of Nazism and its effects on the population, the war and its aftermath. Also, you have not only a particular group of people, but also a place, the city of Danzig, which, as you may know, it belonged to Poland, it belonged to Germany, it was also a free city, so there's a very, very complex history right there with the city of Danzig. And there are many, many symbols of that. The Tin Drum itself is one of those symbols because, as you can see, it has the colors of the Polish flag, and that is not a coincidence, no matter what Oscar himself tells you in the story. So those are 3 points, I think, 3 ways that we can approach, maybe 3 lenses that we can use when approaching the Tin Drum. Now, I wanted to share with you some criticism about this novel from Patrick O'Neill primarily. Here's the thing, I think that the main feeling that is conveyed when it comes to feelings, right? The main emotion or the main mood that is conveyed by this novel is one of guilt. Okay, so that is something that many critics have pointed out. Oscar, you're going to see, is going to accuse himself of many things. Sometimes we think, well, maybe he didn't really do this. It's just that this guilt causes him to assume guilt, what's the other word that I'm looking for? Not guilt, but responsibility, right? For things that happened that really could never have been his fault, right? But we have this ingrained guilt right there. And Patrick O'Neill says, the cumulative, that's a difficult word for me. Okay, the cumulative guilt of the nightmare years of German history is refracted and rearranged most overtly in Oscar's grotesquely distorted narrative of his own personal guilt or lack of it. This is kind of like the center of the novel. And then, still dealing with that same topic, he says later on, the hermeneutic man-trap that is the central characteristic of the Tin Drum as a whole is this one, that we take seriously stories that are quite literally entirely impossible to believe. In the end, the only thing that we can be sure of about Oscar is that he does indeed narrate. So we don't really know if he committed those crimes that he talks about, if he is responsible for those things that he is accusing himself of. And this is something that is directly related to the questioning of history that I was mentioning before. That is the central, also another, key, another focus of the novel right here. And here's an interesting thing. As in French, as in Spanish, there is only one word in German to say history and story. English is a very interesting language in that it makes a distinction between that. But in German, Geschichte, it could mean history or it could mean story, just like historia in Spanish and histoire in French, right? So that's a very interesting thing because it really points to the ambiguous nature of history. Here's something that I always ask my students because I really want to emphasize to them the importance of language. How do you know what happened in the past? Before photographs, before film, which can also be manipulated, by the way. Of course, you had artifacts, you had maybe paintings, depictions of things. But at the end of the day, what you have is a bunch of words, right? It's like somebody's description, somebody's interpretation of what happened in the past. So language is really, really important here. And you could also say that history is also a story. It's just a version most of the time through so many different filters. There's another thing that O'Neill says here about this topic, right? In the end, the Tin Drum, by relentlessly urging the reader throughout to recognize the total unreliability of its narrator, invites the reader to confront the question of narrative unreliability itself. The question as to how reliable any discourse can ever be, since discourse is always a matter not just of presentation but of context-appropriate presentation, putting things in a particular perspective, a particular context, and your context is not necessarily mine, nor mine yours. So that ambiguity of history is what Günter Grass is primarily concerned with. And the Tin Drum is, I think, one of the best examples of that concern. I want to share with you now some quick thoughts about the film adaptation that I was mentioning before. This is the Criterion Collection edition, but it's the older one. Okay, there's a newer one that unfortunately I haven't seen, and it includes extra material, so I'm going by this version, but I think that's good enough for the purposes of this video. The film was released in 1979. There seems to be something with the number 9 going on here with this novel. Published in 59, the film adaptation happens in 79, 20 years later. Günter Grass gets the Nobel Prize in 1999, and then there's another, translation of the novel in 2009. So we have 20 years after the publication of the novel. Of course, there were many offers before that, but Grass was never entirely satisfied with those offers until he spoke to Volker Schlöndorff. Okay, he is the one who finally, Grass felt, understood the character and also understood the epic nature of the story that was being told here, because this might seem like an anti-epic, judging by the narrator's perspective and all that, but it is also an epic story, in a very, very different way than we speak usually of epic stories. Now, the film does not cover the entire novel. Basically what you have is the first and the second books. The third part is completely gone, okay? And as a result, the frame of the story is also missing. That whole idea of the mental institution, when you get rid of the third part, you kind of have to get rid of that too, for reasons that you're going to see if you read the novel. So in the movie, they still framed it. You have the figure of the grandmother. It begins with the figure of the grandmother in a field, right? The chapter, The White Skirt, and then it ends with her in a field. So we have a frame still, but a very different one. Now, many of the side stories, many of the secondary characters also, as I said before, did not make it into the movie. So that means that some of the elements from the first part and the second one were excised from the story. So I would say maybe, when you look at the entire material, maybe the film covers about half, 55, 60% of the kind of story-wise of what you have in the novel. The film, as you may know, won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. I think it was very, very well deserved, even though I will say that I have not seen any of the other movies that were nominated for the award that year. Part of the appeal that this movie had, okay, and this is always kind of an element right there, for good or ill or both, is that when it was released, the film came across as a little bit scandalous. Okay, there are some scenes there in the movie that you're going to notice that this is definitely a risque type of movie. And then fortunately, or fortunately, whatever, however you want to look at it, many people sometimes are drawn to movies for that. It's like, oh, this is a kind of a transgressive movie, let's watch it, just for the sake of, you know, transgression and stuff. But I don't think it's, the words are coming very, very slowly to me today. I don't think it's a sensationalist movie, you know. The scenes that are considered to be risque and all that stuff, they don't make up most of the movie. They're very quickly over. So I think this is a film that really tries to capture well what the novel was saying, and those scenes are, of course, in the novel. So that said, you know, the whole morbid aspect of it and all that kind of stuff, this is an excellent film. It's one of the best films that I have ever seen, and I'm also going to say it's one of the best adaptations of a text that I have ever seen, even though a lot of the original text of the novel is missing in it. If you look at the acting, if you look at the cinematography, they say that the camera was placed a little bit lower than usual to kind of, you know, reflect that idea that this is from the perspective of somebody who has remained a child or has remained childlike or childish, however you want to look at it. So that is also something. Look out for the photography in this movie, and the music. Okay, the music is by Maurice Jarre, so really, really well done. Some great actors here. Okay, we have Angela Winkler, we have Mario Adorf. There's also Charles Aznavour, who has the part of Marcus, the toy seller. So I mean, this is really, really a great film, no matter how you look at it. So my impressions, okay, reading and rereading this text, and I think this is going a little bit long, but that's the way that I wanted to do it with this particular novel. I remember my first experience with the Tin Drum, I have it right here, with this version of it, as kind of a revelation. Okay, this was just a revelation to me. Back then, I even decided to buy a copy in Spanish, because I thought, to me as a writer, it was necessary to read this, to get an idea of narration from this text. I still haven't read it, but I plan to do something about that pretty soon. So this time, my reading experience with the newer translation, the Mitchell one, I'm going to say it was much more difficult. For some reason, the text did not seem to flow as smoothly to me as the first time that I read it. But then, you know, I understand that this is closer to the original German, which also baffled and confused many readers at the time. So maybe that's what's going on right there. And also, I must say that this second reading experience was kind of an interrupted one for me. I was going through some health issues at the time, so I had to stop reading it and then continue. So you see what I'm saying? It's like not really a very smooth experience. But I liked both of them. Okay, I like both versions of the text. I had a great experience reading both of them. I personally am closer to the Manheim translation, maybe because that was the one that I experienced first. So the way that I remember it, at least, I have had, you know, great memories of that initial version. So, bottom line. If The Magic Mountain is regarded as the most important German novel of the first half of the 20th century, or some people would say of the entire 20th century, I think that The Tin Drum occupies that place, you know, takes that place in the second half of the 20th century. And I am not an expert on German literature, unfortunately, but I feel that it really deserves the status that it has. I think this is really a great novel. Now, I have not had, as I have said before, very good experiences with other works by Günter Grass, but I absolutely love him just because he wrote and he published this novel. This novel, I think, really captures the zeitgeist and then some, because it gives you, you know, it just manages to make a very difficult period and a specific place and time just come to life, and it does that in a very interesting way, in a way that is not realistic the way that these stories usually are. There are many great novels that deal with a particular period and with a particular people in a realistic way, and that's wonderful. But in this case, we have a really interesting perspective and a really interesting narrator, and I think much of the greatness of this novel really rests on that. So when it comes to novels, I would definitely say that The Tin Drum makes my top 10 list. This is one of the 10 most important, most memorable novels that I have ever read in my entire life. So I highly recommend that you read it, especially if you are German and have somehow managed to escape this novel. I am talking to you, Ralph. Okay, I asked my friend Ralph, I want to know what you think about this one so that I can include a commentary there in my video. And he said he hadn't read it. I'm like, you know, I just, you know, das ist unglaublich, mein Freund. You need to read it, okay? You absolutely need to read it. You can't afford to miss a novel like this one. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on The Tin Drum by Günter Grass. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.